Hello, everyone. Okay, I think we have everybody here.
That's fantastic.
Yes, yes.
Hello, Prof.
Hello, Prof.
Hello.
Hello, Miriam. Hi.
Hi.
I think I'm meeting for the first time, right? I mean, virtually.
I think so. How are you?
Prof, I wish I was in Lagos right now.
Oh, yeah, we're on the ground eating great food.
Ah, I'm jealous.
I am jealous.
On the ground.
Okay. It's nice to see everybody here.
Yeah.
Can we start?
Oh gosh,
Yeah.
hold on. What is happening with my computer?
You're the chair.
Okay. Thank you. It is an honor to be chairing this roundtable session that is made up of up and coming and established talented scholars. And with Professor Oyeronke Oyewumi as our guest. What we're going to be doing today is deliberating on the thoughts and scholarship of Professor Oyewumi. This eminent thinker, who is also a princess of Ogbomoso, a prominent Yoruba royalty, born in Nigeria and educated at the University of Ibadan and the University of California at Berkeley. Professor Oyewumi has been widely recognized for her ideas and for her intellectual labor. She's also a public intellectual who works with activist organizations and marginalized communities in Africa and its diaspora, in countries and regions such as Brazil, Colombia, the Caribbean, and so on and so forth. Professor Oyewumi has received several fellowships, including Rockefeller Fellowships, a presidential fellowship, and a Ford Foundation grant. Most recently, Professor Oyewumi was awarded the 2021 Distinguished Africanist Award of the African Studies Association. Through her scholarship, Professor Oyeronke Oyewumi has challenged and made us rethink a lot of contemporary era's assumptions about African culture and history. In a seminar and often quoted book, The Invention of Women, Professor Oyewumi makes a convincing case on how the project of colonial modernity helped to shape our current understanding of gender and sexualities across many African societies. I actually hope that one day this book will be translated into the Yoruba language. She builds on these groundbreaking ideas in another monograph, What Gender is Motherhood, by showing us how current notions of masculinity are informed by the Victorian era's masculinity that was imposed by European colonizers and adopted by many African male intellectuals and important figures who were educated in colonial and missionary schools. Other equally important works robustly articulate African feminism and the African female experience of modernity. In addition to winning awards, Professor Oyewumi's books have been translated into many languages. In several articles, edited volumes, and public presentations in countries around the world, she points us to the pervasiveness of coloniality in contemporary thoughts and ways of life. She challenges scholars to not only rethink their scholarship, but also to relearn history of the non-West. Although she's a sociologist, her work is germane to every discipline of cultural studies and the humanities, as well as the social sciences and even medicine. Her ideas and theories have shaped the lives of scholars, human rights activists, feminists, and students alike. In my own work, for example, I have applied Professor Oyewumi's scholarship in applying African knowledge production, oral tests, and written tests, in understanding how the condition of the present have been shaped and even brought about by the exigencies of the past, most notably the rupture brought about by the violence of colonialism. I often refer to Professor Oyewumi whenever I ask myself this question: how has the project of colonial modernity informed today's conceptions of African culture, gender, sexuality, and overall idea of Africanness? My belief is that Professor Oyewumi is not pointing us to the way in which the past is linked to the present, just for the sake of it. Far from it, it is because we cannot fully understand the exigency of our time, that is, the history of the present, without digging deep into how the present came about. This is what Stuart Hall refers to as studying the conjuncture. How did the past transform itself into the present? And what are the forces behind this transformation? Our scholarship samples us to how this rupture became concretized and normalized as African, when, if we dig deeper, there were ideas that were postulated by colonial officers and their African underlings, who served as insiders, outsiders, for and within the project of colonial modernity. But the present is not just encumbered. The present is not just encumbered within the cocoon of the past. What can we do about it? This is what Professor Oyewumi points us to with her ideas on decoloniality. We cannot just give up and say that the present is fixed to the umbilical cord of its past. We can project a different course for the future by unlearning those ideas we are bathed with through the antecedents of the colonial project. Unlearning the present condition of history should go hand in hand in thinking through to the period before the seed of colonial modernity were planted, and to think to a future that frees up our minds to one in which we are free of the shackles of coloniality. Our roundtable proposes to discuss and analyze the way in which Professor Oyewumi has shaped and continue to impact our ideas and also to impact academia in general. I have with me panelists. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves briefly, and then we can go into our discussions. So I'm going to start with Mariam.
Hello. I so wish that I was there in Nigeria. My name is Maram Gay. I was supposed to be there. And I'm an associate professor of African and African diaspora literatures at East Carolina University in North Carolina. And I am originally from Senegal. So glad to be here.
Thank you. Next, can we have Dr. Jumoke Ferrisimo, please?
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here and join in this roundtable. I'm an assistant professor at the Toronto Metropolitan University, and I teach creative writing and African literature.
Thank you. And next, Olajide Salahu.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Prof. I'm so excited to meet you. I'm Olajide Salahu. I'm from the Department of English and Film Studies, University of Alberta. I'm a PhD student there. Thank you.
And next is Oluwaduni Talabi.
Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today and also to see Professor Oyewumi physically. I have your 2 books with me, and it has really, helped me with my research. And I'm joining from Germany, and I recently completed my doctorate degree at the University of Bremen here in Germany. So yeah, it's nice to be here.
Thank you. We also have Christelle Olukoyi.
Hi, everyone.
Olukoyi.
I'm also very honored to be here. My name is Christelle Olukoyi. I'm a PhD student in Black Studies at Harvard University, and an incoming assistant professor at University of Washington.
Thank you. And we also have Victoria Gbadegesin.
She's muted.
Mute, okay. Hello, everyone. Okay, I'm Victoria Oluwamayo from the Federal University, Oyeronke, Nigeria. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of English and Literary Studies, and I'm so honored to be here too. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not the least is Elizabeth Adeyemo. Hello.
Doctoral candidate at the University of Notre Dame Department of Anthropology. It's so great to be here. Thank you for having us, I'm sorry, Adeneko.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Shola Adenekon. I'm currently an associate professor of African literature at Ghent University in Belgium. So the plan today is not to have a formal paper presentation. We hope that to continue with this conversation at next year's ASA conference. So today we're just going to be having a discussion on the thoughts of Professor Oyewumi. I'm going to start with this question, just directed at each and every one of you on the panel. What is that important book or article authored by Professor Oyewumi that influenced or shaped the way you approach your own scholarship, and why? Anyone can go first.
I'll go. So I just wanted to say that this is so long coming, this gathering, and it seems to me that talking about Oyewumi without investing Oyewumi in African tradition is not doing justice to Oyewumi. So in light of that, in my wall of culture, we have two terms. One of them is sargal, which is to honor, to decorate somebody, and also chant, which is to thank somebody for what they have done, their contribution. And I view this gathering in those two terms. For me, and when I was thinking about this, it took me back to my time as a graduate student at the at the State University of New York in Binghamton, where I first met Oyewumi in person. And I was thinking about how I am going to frame my talk, my contribution today, and I thought that it would be three things. And the questions would lead me to one or the other. But I'm looking at it in three ways. Reading and studying Oyewumi, teaching Oyewumi, and then knowing Oyewumi on the personal level, because she's somebody that I could call a friend to. And I think that sometimes we tend to, in academia, to dismiss our private lives and what they mean to us. So the work that really did it for me, of course, is going to be the same for many people, is The Invention of Women, which as a student who freshly came from Senegal to study in the US, and finding myself in classes where the women are talked about, then I don't recognize them. I don't see them as the women that I know in my lives. And sitting there and really scratching my head about, okay, what kind of women are they talking about that are so hapless? These women that have no power. They certainly do not look like the women I grew up with. I grew up in a Wolof family of griots, and certainly my aunts, my grandmothers are the most powerful women that I know. whether it is in private or in public. My grandmother, for example, was one of the first women to come up with a musical genre that is quintessentially women, and then has a band that is quintessentially women. And that one actually spread all over Senegal and even internationally. And when you say the name of my hometown or my region, people think about that musical genre that was created by this woman. So this takes me back to the time when I was at the University of Dakar, when I started to think about what I focused on as my master's thesis. And I had gone to, when many of my classmates were studying British or American literatures, I studied African literatures. And through that, I discovered the rich oral literature of Africa, especially of the Wolof, where I come from. And then I went on a field work to study my grandmother's work and the wedding song that they composed and sang. But when I came to my advisor and said that I wanted to do this as my thesis, I was told by the university administration that I could not write my thesis on that material because it was in Wolof, not in English. So as distraught as I was, I took that material and brought it to the US to focus, to study with another Nigerian, Opeo, and did that as my thesis for my doctoral. So to go back to having this material, being told that it is not going to be something that I will write about because it is not English, and then finding Oyewumi in class and realizing that, okay, now I have something that can really direct me as a framework to look at this material that I was told that was profane, was not sophisticated enough, and I could study. So reading Oyewumi gave me the tools that I needed to look at Africa from the center, from Africa itself, and outward, instead of departing from somewhere else to arrive at Africa. So I don't want to be long, and we'll expand on that. But that's what Invention of Women is definitely the work that did it for me.
Okay, go on, it's fine.
Okay, I could go next if that's okay. Yeah, so for me, I did my master's here in Germany as well, and in 2013, and I did it in transnational studies, which was basically exploring the cultures and literatures, of the global world. And then for my master thesis, I knew I wanted to write something, do a feminist analysis. And then for my master thesis, I explored like autonomy, emancipation in African women's literature. But then I used Judith Butler and Simone de Beauvoir, for my theories. And then I remember in my introduction writing something like, of course, there are African feminist theories, Afrofeminist theories, womanism and everything, but I am not, interested in differentiating. Instead, I'm just interested in analyzing this. So coming to my PhD thesis, dissertation, I knew I wanted to do something on Black feminism and intersectionality, looking at, the intersections of oppression and how it impacts Black women globally. So that was when I picked up The Invention of Women for the first time. That was in 2018. And then I read it and I was like, okay, wow, this is really deep. This is something I've not even, known about, because then again, the curriculum for my master's program was very European and Euro-American. And I would just read like a paragraph from my PhD thesis, just dissertation, just for you to know how you have influenced my work so much. So I say that I start because with my PhD dissertation, I used a self-reflexive approach for my introduction. So I wrote a little bit about how I came to choose my topic and everything. So I said, for master's program, my preoccupation was to use literature to interrogate the dichotomy of gender and endogenous patriarchal social norms in the Nigerian society. However, my argument that theories do not matter as long as they are feminist in hindsight justifies Oyeronke Oyewumi's call out of African elites who raised in Western academy and entrenched in Western ways fail to recognize that African societies have their spiritual identities and distinct ways of thinking and organizing before European context. While my master thesis exuded excellence in exploring the processes of how heteronormative gender socialization is fabricated, my bypassing of Black feminist, Afro-centered, and anti-racist lenses meant a shortcoming in the deconstruction of gender in relation to space and time periods, and a discrepancy in my imagined alternative realities of gender, justice, and liberation of African women from systems of domination. I dare to begin my introductory chapter by telling my own story and struggle through epistemological paradigms for context, because I aim to show that I am not magically equipped with an objective epistemological lens, as should nobody attempting to work with sociocultural biographies dare to claim. So this, was my introduction to my PhD dissertation. And I'm just very happy to be here today and to see physically. Like I said, I have your two books, What Gender is Motherhood. I read it deeply. I always make my markings, all over the books. Like, it's just the two books that I make markings all over. So yeah, your books have really influenced me. I also teach queer contemporary discourses for masters and undergraduate programs. And I also use your books as well as, my feminist theory. So yeah, that's my own, introduction to your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Timoni. Who's going to go next, please?
Yeah, I can go next now.
Okay, please.
I actually admire Professor Oyewumi a lot because for me, my contribution comes from the idea of being from a writer's perspective, which is framing identity. That's framing my identity being Yoruba, and also being a writer in what would be considered a cultural space that has a disregard for our social realities. And what Professor Oyewumi describes as the world, which is not considered in these spaces. So in trying to understand and establish my identity, Professor Oyewumi's, of course, scholarship gives me a mode for thinking through my identity in that space. And I had to write a bit of this down so that I could. So I'm going to read a bit of it out. I was inherently deemed a feminist in the Nigerian cultural space even before I introduced myself to be so, understood the ideology enough to own it. I came into the cultural space as a teenager. And one of the things that I observed is that being a cultural enthusiast in my teenage years, it soon became evident to me that it felt almost automatic to be dubbed feminist for being loud about one's views or challenging forms of invisibility in the literary establishment. To be a writer who writes and criticizes the status quo is to go against the grain. It was therefore not uncommon to find that some women resist the label of feminist because it didn't exactly capture who they were, but still there was nothing to represent what they knew about themselves outside of this categorization based on their biology. In a space that has adopted and prioritized Western biological fixed categories, how can one, I began to think of how to articulate the needs to be recognized as more than the sum of my biological parts. In most cases, to appease women, I found that in most cases in these spaces, to appease women who insist on being seen beyond their biology, it is not uncommon for those who enjoy the use of their category as women to construct special events and magazine issues for the female gender as forms of tokenism or ghettoization, in which women problems can be examined carefully by these women so that they won't complain that they were never given a chance to shine. For me, this actually formed a kind of disruption in the place I wanted to see myself. And when I read Professor Oyewumi in The Invention of Women, and how she problematized the category women, which is central to Western gender discourses, as inexistent in Yoruba land, practice prolonged interaction with the West, and how it is a periodization in itself, which is a form of which is a phenomenon that began during colonialism. I began to think of how to reconstruct the womaning of my art, in which the themes that I write about were not controlled by the influences of the cultural space that expected me simply to write about women issues because I'm a woman. So I'm going to stop there, but I perhaps in further make other contributions. But the core of my contribution is that in reading Professor Oyewumi's The Invention of Women, I found a definition for the identity that I wanted to construct in the cultural space.
Thank you. Thank you for that contribution. Who's going to go next?
Okay, I can go next.
Thank you. Yes, please go for it.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Unlike many people who have read Professor Oyewumi before, very recently, I came in contact first with the call. Then I was actually very interested in the gender part of our work and the fact that it's talking about the Yoruba culture. Maybe because I'm Yoruba, and maybe because I'm also very, very interested in culture generally. So it's an invention of women for me. And honestly, since I've been reading the book, I have found it very interesting and engaging. Each time I have a question that I wanted to ask, because I look at different institutions and I'll be like, okay, what about this? If this is it. And by the time I'm reading the next chapter, there's something about the answers to the questions that have been raised. Then I find the categorization not being based on gender very, very interesting for me. It's the first time I'm reading about the male and female, the Anna body now, the body not being the definition of a social identity and relationship and all that. And so I find it very, very interesting. And it's the invention of women. Honestly, that's the one I've engaged most with. That's the one I've referenced once in my writing, and I find it very, very, very interesting. I'm curious about a lot of things. I believe that in the course of this panel discussion, I'll be able to say some of the things that I am very curious about. But I find it very engaging. And thank you, Professor Oyewumi, for making that extensive interrogation of the Yoruba culture. I mean, it's as if you just dissected everything about the culture. You answered every question I would have wanted to ask. Of course, I'm still curious about some things, but it's a great read for me. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for putting that so well as well. We have, I think we have 3 more responses. We should anyway. Who wants to go next, please?
I could go next. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm in transit, so I really hope my internet does not go off again. It's great to be here today, and I started to engage with Professor Oyewumi's work in my first year of grad school, and it was a bit of an interesting situation because my professors mentioned Professor Oyewumi's work about three times in 1 week, and they said, "Elizabeth, have you read Oyewumi Invention of Women? Elizabeth, have you read Oyewumi's that?" It was in biological anthropology class and sociocultural anthropology class as well. So that after hearing that like 3 times consecutively, I'm like, okay, I have to do this. And so after reading many of Professor Oyewumi's work, myself and my advisor decided to integrate gender into my research. I am an archaeologist, and towards the end of my answer to my response to this, I would then post how my work specifically engages gender, inspired by the works of Professor Oyewumi and the challenges that this poses. So, although from engaging with publicly available articles and books by Professor Oyewumi, I found that our work cuts across multiple themes of gender, not just gender decolonization and Yoruba hermeneutics and ontologies, which offer valuable insight into the different ways of being. And I also emphasize here the hegemony of knowledge production. However, for this roundtable, I choose to focus on Professor Oyewomi's work on gender and sociocultural lifeways. And in doing this, I want to talk a bit about the biopolitics of gender and sex and how Professor Oyewomi's work push us to challenge existing knowledge or existing mainstream knowledge of the biopolitics of gender and sexuality. And the asymmetrical modes of the execution and extraction of the agency of personal and collective choice makes biopolitics of gender very questionable. Gender views, although originating from the West, are generally applied as universals to other societies in the world in public discourse. And this hegemonic attitude is fostered by the situation of knowledge production, theories, and epistemology of the gender and sex from an Anglo-American perspective and ideology. And Professor Oyewomi's work challenges this Western construct of gender and the practice of gender as a defining point for relationship and social structures. As some of the panelists have mentioned, our work highlights relationality and context-specific negotiations of gender relations, particularly in Yoruba societies. Gender viewed with Western lenses are generally applied as universals in the world, and so it clouds how gender is perceived from other indigenous or incipient societies. The legacies of colonialism have also impacted understanding and perception of African sexuality and gender relations. And this is because the early studies of African relationality were influenced by Western dichotomized view of sexuality and genders, which then relate onto interpretation of African social relations. We have seen this in many literature from the pre-colonial, during the colonial and just post-colonial period in Nigeria, where on Yoruba or about Yoruba society is often dichotomized, primarily because that's how it works in the Western and Anglo-European context. So in our book, The Invention of Women, Professor Oyewomi uses the term cultural logic to first show how gender is culturally conceptualized and performed, and secondly, to track the hegemonic patterns of knowledge production and distribution globally, a foundation that is important for contextualizing the emergence and development studies in and about Yoruba community. Overall, Professor Oyewomi's work to me emphasized that context and history are germane to the interrogation, interpretation, and application of theory, irrespective of the geopolitical location. African cultural logic ought to inform a redirection towards inclusivity and advancement in the understanding of multiple families, to conceptualize it and investigate it in many ways to be human. So going back to my work, how I engage Professor Oyewomi's literature, I attempt to investigate gender in some societies in Nigeria, but because I am an archaeologist, the question then becomes, what does gender look like in the archaeological record? And so, looking at all of the theories that the foundation that Professor Oyewomi has laid about how gender ought to looks like over the many decades of existence of the Yoruba societies, it becomes much more difficult to see, for me, at least in my work, how would gender be represented in the archaeological record. And so initially, I tried to use fingerprints on ceramics to investigate if there are gender patterns in the production of ceramics, for example. But then this then goes on to be that by investigating gender in this manner, do we then go back to dichotomizing gender all over again, right? So I had to take a step back from integrating gender in my work to be much more reflective about how I want to look at gender in my research. So you see how Professor Oyewomi's work laid the foundation for my own work to begin to think about how gender looks like or would look like in the archaeological record. I think for me, that's the more impactful side of things. And I'm sure this doesn't happen to just me. This has happened to many other archaeologists who work on incipient African communities. And I think maybe in the near future, I will reach out to Oyewumi again, and we can have a dialogue about how this might look like in the archaeology curriculum. Because as difficult as it might sound, it is a necessity for research in archaeology, because archaeology is about the path beyond written knowledge, right? Beyond written sources. So how would gender have looked like in the distant past in African societies, particularly Yoruba and Igbo culture in Nigeria? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's a question we can always revisit during the course of this particular session as well. It's an important question. It's an important question. So we still have Professor Olukoyi and Professor Olajide to come. We need your responses, please.
Yes, I can go next.
Okay.
Thank you for this question. I think for me, the way I encountered the work was a bit particular because it wasn't in an academic context. So I grew up in France for background, and I was doing an internship in a public library. And someone gave me that book as I was doing the internship, saying that I might be interested in it. And I was quite young at the time, and my English level wasn't great. So I read it, but I read it the way you read something you know is amazing, but you can't necessarily grasp everything out of it. And I read just like, I think at that time I read the introduction and the first chapter. And I was like, it did transform me in many ways. It made me reflect on the structure of my own family, and the kinds of like almost matriarchal features I was noticing in the way my family, my mother's side of the family is not Yoruba, my father's side is Yoruba, but my mother's side, there was this emphasis on reproduction and not on marriage. And the way people were framing patriarchal oppression was always framed through this idea that like marriage is a thing young girls or women are taught to do. And my family, I was never said I had to marry anyone. I was always said, when are you going to give us a child? And everything was about reproduction, however it happened. But I had to like give my mother and give my grandmother a child. And there were the two that were always saying, and my aunts too were telling me that, you have to give us a child. So that, even if that's not exactly the same kind of cultural logic that Oyeronke's book is talking about, it made me relate and think about what were the kind of like worldviews or world senses that shaped this emphasis on reproduction. And it also made me very interested in African languages, and I started learning isiZulu because at the time I was interested in South Africa. And then later on, I also started learning Yoruba, which is my father's language, but I did not grow up speaking it. And years later, when I was in the United States, in New Orleans, I was teaching French at Tulane University as a lecturer. And we were also allowed to take classes at the same time. And I took a gender class. And I encountered that book again, and I was reading it, and I was like, I've read this before. Like, I know I've encountered this book before, but this time I was able to like actually understand and grasp a bit better the ramifications of what was being said, and I was also able to like read it in its entirety. And that's one of the books that really made me want, because when I was doing that lectureship, my goal was then go back to France and start a PhD in France, where I had a PhD scholarship, but in a traditional discipline. But when I encountered that book, it made me want to like made me interested in like thinking in a more capacious manners in terms of like what the scope of my research and my project could be. And it made me want to, it made me a bit cautious or a bit distrustful of African studies and of disciplines, especially one sentence that has one passage in the book that has shaped me is how Professor Oyeronke Oyewumi always emphasize wanting to think about slavery and colonialism in the same analytical frame, and thinking about the origins of colonialism from the get-go, from the transatlantic slave trade. And that sense of chronology, that sense of timeline, kind of shaped how I wanted myself to think about my how I'm thinking about the trajectory and the timeline of my project. And then something else was the argument, and here I think also in conversation with Peter Eke as a mentor, was the argument that was being made about contemporary African societies, and thinking about the inheritors of the colonial state in Peter Eke's formulation, not just in terms of inheritors like as a social class, but also the gendered inheritors of the colonial state and the gendered colonial state. So those were two elements that and also the kind of location at the time of Professor Oyewumi in Black Studies. Those were elements that made me want to think about this project in a more diasporic frame, thinking about race, thinking about white supremacy, thinking about colonialism and its afterlives, instead of something that has a beginning and an end. And then there was this like one little sentence that's related in my project in the book. when I read the book again, but this time thinking really like in relation to my project, which is, by the way, on nightlife. And I'm thinking about nightlife, not in the terms of like entertainment that takes place at night, but how people make lives out of the night. And there was this sentence about Ogbomoshos and its night markets, and how much more lively they were than the day markets, and this kind of like structural like ordering of time, and how like colonialism also changed the fundamental sense of temporal organization. And that also really impacted my project. So thank you for everything. And yeah, this book is transformative.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Now we have you, Olajide Salau.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Prof, for your contribution to African scholarship. I think my encounter with Prof's work is quite informal. I would have wanted it in a kind of formal setting, classroom setting, when they introduced theories to us, but it came later, like an afterthought, after we have learned much about Western feminism. And I will refer to my years in Ife when I was doing for my undergraduate program, when I think it was the third year or the fourth year that we had a class on theories, and they were teaching us some of these theories, Marxism and feminism, post-colonialism, all the isms. Anyway, so but one thing I noticed in the kind of the curriculum we were introduced to was actually how we were supposed to, I think we were supposed to learn about African theorists first. Now I'm thinking that, but then I didn't know anything anyways. So I was just consuming what they were teaching me, and I was glad that I was learning about all this big grammar and vocabularies and all these isms and ideologies. So I feel now that, and I think if we go back to school again, we go back to Ife, a lot of dominant part of the curriculum has not been reviewed. You realize that some of these theories are still taught in kind of rotate form. You come years in, years out, students learn the same thing and they are not reviewed. I feel that so during our master's degree program in Ife as well, I think it was a class in which the professor asked us to actually think about coming up with an abstract. It's quite I mean, I didn't know how to write an abstract, and so they said we should all write an abstract, and I was like, okay, let's go about it. So I came up with something, and then someone asked me, we're just having a kind of discussion. Someone asked me, have you read Invention of Women by Oyeronke Oyewumi? And I was like, oh, so there's a book like that. So I went ahead and then read some part of the book. Then later, I also realized that you have written another one, What Gender is Motherhood? And I was like, what? So because I was so surprised because I felt that there was actually a course on theories as well. And on that theory, we were learning about simony and all of the Western feminists. And I was like, so how much of that curriculum could have been dedicated to African scholarship? And like, we should learn much about our home before we go outside. I believe in this internal introspection before we move outside and learn about what is outside. If we don't know what is at home, we won't know what is outside. So that's part of my informal introduction to professor's work. And also, when I now started thinking about my PhD project, part of my project is mainly on migration, urban rural migration, and I have been thinking about how gender is linked to rurality, rural space, rural community. Why women at some particular point in time during the post-colonial period actually sent back home to the villages to go and acquire fallows because the city is seen as a site of decadence, absurdities and moral decadence and all of the corruption that we can think about. So, and I'm thinking in that regard how the idea that the rural is ideal, unique, and this utopic, morally, gold site is actually linked to coloniality itself. How that notions actually transferred seamlessly during the colonial period to actually think about the rural space as this utopic without actually thinking critically about how some of these Western ideas came into our understanding of space in the post-colonial period. So I actually was thinking in that I've been thinking in that direction on my project, which I'm using Sadi Adenayo's work and third generation Nigerian novels to investigate. So I would say the third point I want to make is my connection. I won't say connection anyways, but I have friends in the Ogbomoso, and I go through. I'm from Kwara State, so I'm from Shao, Kwara State. So I move through Ogbomoso anytime I'm going to Ife and buy akara diti and all of those things. And I think about how that space, which I know, which I've stayed because I have friends who schooled in Lautech, and I move around the environment, stadium area, and all of these places, and kind of rich cultural something that how it informed your theory. Especially, I'm talking about now. One fascinating aspect of your scholarship is seniority, which I find very, very interesting, because as soon as I got to that place where you actually using that argument on seniority to tackle some of this received Western epistemology, I have been thinking about how some of proverbs I learned while growing up. How all of those things actually came and form part of the framework of seniority in Invention of Women. So thank you for your contribution. I really love your work, and I feel that a lot of our thinking can actually be informed locally before we go abroad and think about how we want to use framework from the other side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gide, and thank you to other members of this panel for your insight and for your contribution, for your testimonies. I think I want to add that those of you in the panel in the room can also join the discussion as we go on, and also some of our panelists have questions for Professor Oyewumi, which we are going to take towards the end of this particular session. But going through what all of you have said, I could see a abiding trend with regarding scholarship, especially thinking about the kind of cultural scholarship that we have on the continent and also within our communities in the diaspora. So this question has been posed by one of the panelists for all of us to discuss. How can we decolonize our cultural scholarship, which is highly gendered in its own way to an extent and grounded in colonial hegemonies? Any one of you can take that. How can we
Can you
decolonize
please
our
repeat the
scholarship?
question?
Okay, how can we
Can you please-
decolonize cultural scholarship on the continent, which is highly gendered in its own way to an extent and grounded in colonial hegemonies?
I will piggyback on what the last panelist said, and talking about that Olajide Salau, talking about the curriculum. I also did my bachelor's in English studies in Nigeria before leaving, and I also did theories like feminism, post-colonialism, Elizabethan era, you know, these kind of things. And like he said, it was just, you know, regurgitation actually. And anyway, the curriculum, the whole education system, everything, you know, it's just about regurgitating, writing whatever you cram, you put it down, you pass your exams, and those kind of things. And it was not until getting to Germany here and doing my master's program that I had to, you know, go back again and record. Like, I had no idea what I was doing when I first got to Germany, and they were teaching me in class. I was like, what are they talking about, you know? But then I had to do my own personal study and stuff. So I think the first thing is the curriculum itself, because if you are producing students, you know, from the university and you are pushing them out into the society, then you have to educate them in the right way or in the indigenous way, like to familiarize them with theories and concepts that are very indigenous. So, and if we are not doing that, then of course we are educating them within the colonial epistemes. And this is also impacting, you know, this is impacting our opinions on issues, our perspectives and everything. So basically that's the curriculum is the first thing that needs to be decolonized. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
I will go and I'm going to actually read you what I wrote about my second part in this reflection, which is teaching Oyewumi and what that means to teach Oyewumi. When I started teaching, especially at the graduate level, I made sure that Oyewumi's introductory chapter to the invention of women was among the first texts my students read. I often start the class with Binyawanga Wanana's How to Write About Africa, then followed up with Oyewumi. I teach in the South, and in our program, we have teachers who are coming back and to get their master's degree. Most have read and taught only one book about Africa, Achebe's Things Fall Apart. And when they read Oyewumi, I can feel their digital jaws drop, because this is an online class based on the awe with which they engage the text and reflect on the single story they had of Africa. Many come back to me looking to read more of Oyewumi. What these reactions reveal to me is that Westerners cannot change their single story of Africa if us Africans do not change our single story of ourselves. So for me, to teach Oyewumi means also to reflect on our own decolonial deconstruction and journey itself. Furthermore, the West has a lot to learn from Africa, and Oyewumi's work allows us to present Africa as a place of plenitude, not luck, which we have always presented Africa as such, a place where human knowledge originated and still thrives. In exploring gender and sexual orientation, for example, Oyewumi's work has revealed to my students that Africans have solved the pronoun issue from the beginning, because in the societies where there are gendered pronouns, non-gendered pronouns, gender is not a binary, and the societies factor in all genders, at least at the language level. And I keep speaking here as somebody who is not Yoruba, who comes from a West African culture that has so many similarities with Yoruba. So I think that what Oyewumi's work has done is expand this idea of language and Africa and Africans' autonomies and in terms of epistemologies, and that we have a lot to teach the world only if we know how to do that. We start having conversations about what would the English language or French language look like if they adopted pronouns like a Wolof pronoun called, say, that you say mom, a Wolof non-gender third person, which is different from nyom, a non-gender third person plural. Wouldn't these European languages be richer and more inclusive of gender fluid persons? And then it goes from there. So again, I think that if we are going to deconstruct and decolonize, we have to depart from Africa again as a place of plenitude, not as a place of lack, that has a lot to teach to the rest of the world.
Thank you. Thank you for that profound response, Professor. That's actually what I was also just thinking. I was going to ask this question regarding current debate over transgender and cisgender and some of the controversy in the Western Hemisphere over the idea of labels and naming of gender. So, but I'm going to allow the rest of the panel to respond to the questions. Who wants to go next, please?
I'm going to go next because Miriam just actually touched on the part that I'm interested in, which actually from the I'm going to move away from the frame of gender fluidity, but it actually aligns a little with some of the things she's discussed. When Professor Oyewumi in the intervention of women makes an argument for the choice, or I mean the word woman as non-existent in the Yoruba world sense, I think she already foregrounded the idea of decolonization, asking us to take note of language and its control in how it colonizes the different space. I think there's been a reference to curriculum, but outside of the curriculum, even in the public space, the use of language and the way we ignore its significance in embedding this colonial subjectivities actually persist in, like I mentioned, the cultural sphere. My references are usually going to, in this panel, are going to be in reference to how gender operates in the cultural space where I operate mostly. But my point here is that in problematizing that choice of word, she opens us to not only decolonize in the academe, but also outside of the academia, and begin to think of how our relations and how the words that we use, because language is the official language. I mean, English is the official language of Nigeria, and in these cultural spaces where the word, when being referred to woman, also means being subtly told that my biology functions as a representation of my creative practice, then there is already an ongoing otherness, that othering rather of my person that excludes me from being human, you know. And this is where I consider the work that Professor Oyewumi scholarship is doing very important and relevant, and begin to think of ways that we can bring it into the public space, even beyond academia, such that the way language is used returns us to history, as she has done in her work, by returning to the Oyo, so how language functions among the Yoruba Oyo, which she pays attention to, and tell people, just like Miriam has done, paying attention to our heritage as the wall of language, and how it makes a case for rethinking ideas of fluidity, idea of gendering, or what I would also describe as womaning in the different spaces that we occupy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Who else want to contribute, please?
Okay, I would like to say something very briefly. And just like the last panelist said, language is very important, and we actually, we are able to make sense of our world through the kind of language that is spoken. And I think the misconception about gender, just like is seen from the way language is used, comes from the way people represent their word in language. So language is very important, and we might want to pay attention to that. Also, scholarship, I think it is very important that we begin to reinterrogate what we know about ourselves. Well, maybe because I'm very young, I believe that whatever it is that I've read, that I know about gender, apart from Professor Oyewumi's work, has always been that gender is binary, and the superiority is associated with the male gender. And I see that in cultural productions, recent ones too. And productions, films, songs, they reflect in what we do. Then if we begin to incorporate our real identity, what our history exactly is like, into those cultural productions, we might actually be helping the next generation, or reorientating even those of us who are engaged in the academia, or reorientating us about who we are as against what we are made to believe about ourselves. And it's beginning to make sense to me now that I'm thinking about it, that these traditions, this culture, especially our oral tradition, have elements of what Professor Oyewumi already said about gender. You will see that some proverbs actually eulogizes the place of women in the society. I mean the Yoruba proverbs now. Eulogize the place of women in the society. Some lineage panegyrics, name some female heroines and all that. So if we begin to pay attention to those cultural productions, we might be able to actually come up with the exact image of the, let me use that term, ana male, ana female in our society. And that would help us to actually project who we are as defined by ourselves, not as defined by the Western culture. Thank you.
Yeah, I also have, there's two things that this question makes me think about. How do we decolonize our cultural scholarship? The first thing is, I think my own hesitation at cultural scholarship and my impulse to ask, what is cultural scholarship? And I think, because I think I come from a conception of culture that is very suspicious of culture as a term, and as a term that emerges from anthropological research, like the generalization of culture as a concept. It's an anthropological concept that then comes to be generalized. And its generalization in the 1960s has a lot to do with Cold War scholarship. And the attribution by anthropologists of areas that have culture or tradition, and areas that have society and laws. And I think I'm personally very suspicious of that kind of othering project, creating essential differences. And I think the invention of women gives actually weapons to think in other ways against that kind of like Cold War othering conception of culture. Because precisely what the book is responding to is an archive constituted by missionaries, constituted by anthropologists, constituted by historians, by theologians, that pretend to give the definitive word about Yoruba culture as being patriarchal, based off the specifics of a colonial encounter that distorts the realities that are being encountered. And I think what the book does, using this concept of word sense rather than the idea of culture, is to think about how do you contextualize encounter, how do you contextualize culture, not as this like unchanged thing, but something that is inscribed in specific political economy, specific parameters that contextualize how those things emerge to be the way they are. What kind of political or economic or social organization makes seniority the dominant organizing logic for a specific location? And something that I also appreciate in the book is this grounding in place, like thinking about Oyo, and it's not about that very like that sense of like caution and grounding. It's about Oyo, and it's about Oyo at that specific point in time. And thinking about how do we grapple with both the fact that Western notions of gender are not universal. It wasn't always that way, and it doesn't always have to be that way. But how do we also grapple with another aspect of the book, which I think is not as much for granted, which is that question of the colonial inheritors, the inheritors of the colonial state. How do we grapple with the fact that Western notions of gender, even if they are not universal, have been made hegemonic by a colonial enterprise? How do we grapple with a present in which gender logics have been presented as something that is natural, self-evident, and the role of scholarship, for me, decolonizing scholarship as Professor Oyewumi's scholarship, is to create that sense of defamiliarization, go against the way in which the world in which we live is presented to us as like self-evident or natural, and create that sense of deconstruction, but also proposing alternatives to the way things are. And then also because I don't necessarily, I'm thinking about Eve Tuck and Kay Young's article, Decolonization is not a metaphor. How do we think about, in material, practical terms, decolonization, like the impacts, like how do we think about decolonization, not just as something that is in the realm of the symbolic, in the realm of narratives, but also at the level of material resources and the distribution of resources. And I think, yeah, that's also one aspect that I would want to emphasize in relation to Professor Oyewumi's scholarship.
Yes.
Thank you. Yep, go for it. Yep.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. So I think thanks for the contribution so far, everyone. I really, I love all the points made so far. And I just want to add that as we are thinking about decolonization, the colonial thinking, and all of those things, it seems that it's kind of a product word now. It sells book, it sells scholarship, it's capitalistic in some way. So people had the colonial this, the colonial that, or everything, and it sells faster. So I think it's one way to use it effectively. It's one way to use it capitalistically, like if that word exists. So, but that's just by the way. So I just want to say that much of what we are thinking about decolonization today, the colonial thinking, I think it has been happening since the publication such as Invention of Women. I feel that the work which is grounded in Yoruba culture, cosmology and epistemology, it's quite decolonial and radical. And I say radical in the very positive sense, because I feel that when one wants to interrogate a particular event or phenomenon, I think one should start from the inside, like I said, and before, and I feel that that was what Professor Oyeronke Oyewumi did with the Invention of Women. She started from the immediate environment that she understood so much and she could talk authoritatively about. Then she went outside and then speak to what has been sent to her, speak back to that very thing. And I feel that's what the colonial thinking is all about, to speak from inside. And in my application, I think why I've chosen part of a framework to use in my work is because the very context of Imagine This, written by Sadi Adedina, is Yoruba culture. And the gender case made inside that book is somehow, it can't be like separated from that particular culture in one way or the other, because a lot of events and activities going on in the book and the illustration presented to us by Sadi Adedina are quite something I could relate with as someone who grew up in the village and who saw so much of the things that happen in that text. So also, something I just wanted to say about this decolonial thinking is that much of our scholarship back home, because it is what we I feel that decolonial thinking should actually begin earlier than we actually think, especially people who school in an African environment like Nigeria, right? So, for example, when we are talking about decolonial thinking, I feel that much of our pedagogical approach in the universities in Nigeria, some of us who schooled in Nigeria and before we came to the West to actually acquire education, we are so much grounded in European thought and epistemology. I've learned about Shakespeare. I've almost read about Shakespeare before even I was introduced to oral literature, right? I was, in fact, in part 4 of our undergraduate program, a whole course was dedicated to Shakespeare. A whole course. I feel, yeah, Shakespeare, I'm not saying Shakespeare is not useful in literature and, it's in also whatever we want to think about his work and his drama, his poetry, and all of the works he has done in literature. But I'm saying that a whole course is dedicated to Shakespeare. I want an African author, perhaps a writer, perhaps a kind of case study that will actually present in the same way, that will actually grind me in that particular Yoruba.
I was just going to text him, Papa.
Sorry, there's actually. So I feel what. Sorry.
That's not you, Gide. I think it's Dr. Diemo. I think that was you. Gide, continue.
Okay, so I feel that what if we learn about an African writer as a student of literature in the same category? What if perhaps a whole section is dedicated to, say, Achebe or say Ngwigi Wachongo, and we learn about all his work, his collection of works, and whether it is novel, whether it is drama, and all of those things. So I feel all of those things. I feel that internal investigation has to happen before we can now decolonize from outside. Like, we are decolonizing without actually thinking about what actually, because we can't start, and we also have to consider the policymakers, the politicians. Much of what goes inside the curriculum, they don't even understand what decolonization is all about. We are so separated. They actually they control also the curriculum as well. They don't even know what we are thinking. We are just doing our own choice by the side. The politicians are also making the policies about education by the other side, without actually, there is no connection. Separation is between the two categories. Thank you.
Sorry, I have to mute myself as well. Is there anybody else among the panelists who also want to add their own contribution before we move on to the next question? Thank you, Olajide, for that. Who else want to contribute before we move on?
I think I would like to emphasize the point that Dr. Mariama, if I'm Mara,
Yeah, Professor,
mentioned when she responded to this prompt. And a lot of gems have been dropped in response to this topic of decolonization, truly. And the emphasis here is on pedagogy and epistemology, both home and away. And by home, I mean both on the continent and out of the continent. I really value the approach that Dr. Mariam has shared with us on how she conducts our research, on how she structures our classes in the diaspora. Because decolonization is hard work. It's not easy work. And really, I even much more, I value even much more the effort by our predecessors, and by predecessors, the people who have worked so that the young scholars like can fly. We're literally standing on their shoulders. So work like Soyomi's work has been radical, really, in pushing some of the existing narratives that have been sustained for a very long time. So when we talk about decolonization, it's not just us reading about the work of people who push for decolonization. It's about us advancing the work that have been done already by previous scholars in the efforts to decolonize academia. And decolonization is not just theory, it's not just pedagogy, it's also practice. Many of us in the fields that we work in, we have methodologies that we employ to ask the sort of questions that we ask, or to do the sort of research that we do. So in what ways can we decolonize some of these methodologies? In what way can we engage with the work that we do in a way that emphasizes the indigeneity of the knowledge that we produce? So making knowledge production and consumption not just one way, but showing in academia, not just on the continent, but wherever we are represented, how there are multiple ways to be human. And for me, I think that is what really emphasizes decolonization, in that there are multiple pathways to get at the same thing. And Western knowledge production is not the sole source of knowledge production or even distribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Because of pressure of time, I'm going to allow Professor Oyewumi to respond to our discussions. And there's a question in the chat for you after that as well.
So you're not going to give me a question?
No, well, that's the question here. I thought maybe you might have something to say with what the parents have said, but that's a question here from somebody. Can I give you, would you rather take the question first?
It's all part of the same to me, so.
Okay, so I'm going to read that question. Can you see the question?
Okay, yes.
Can you see the question?
Put it up again, please.
Okay. He said, given the decline in studying, learning, and preserving history, especially in Nigerian schools, and even in the general society, and decline and erasure in our culture, how do we find answers that will shape our thinking and knowledge about the context we are writing about, so that we understand our settings enough to theorize?
Okay, my first reaction to that is an invitation for us to focus beyond academic institutions, the academy, or whatever formal institutions the hegemonic powers put in front of us. Okay, so because when we talk about history, I think one of the things that invention shows, and I know Maram, who is a griot, will attest to that. Much of Yoruba history is not in books. It's in everyday life. It's in Oriki. And I'm sure it's not only Yoruba. And so what I want to emphasize is that we have to go beyond formal disciplines. We have to go beyond the establishments. In fact, this fixation on disciplines in which we find ourselves is a problem for us as Africans, is a problem in African studies, because many of these disciplines were not only constituted when we were not in the room, but they were actually constituted against us. So the invitation is that our thinking has to be really radical, and we have to break all the bonds of the disciplines, rules of disciplines that they have put in front of us. I was thinking of archaeology as, I don't know who was talking about archaeology. Who is the archaeologist here? That archaeology is very interesting and very important, especially archaeology in the Yoruba dispensation. And I would invite the scholar to look at Aki Ogundiran's work, because Aki Ogundiran is an archaeologist. And in my own work, indeed, at some point, I had to engage with the archaeology that had been done on Yoruba society. The so-called terracotta heads, one of the questions I posed is that why are they all regarded as men? What in those Ife heads tell us that it's only male? People don't ask that question. When you ask such a question, they're kind of shocked that you would even pose the question. So I think that one of the issues about gender, about imposition, has to do with our complicity. The way we just make these things go on and reproduce themselves. I also think it is very much related to decolonization. I want to hesitate to introduce this here, but I think maybe this is also the place to introduce it. The idea of decolonization and decolonizing is a double-edged sword, in terms of the fact that I gave a lecture, I believe it was in March, at the University of Johannesburg, in which I started questioning the ubiquity with which we use this word, this concept of decolonization. And then, of course, I was bringing in the work of Olufemi Taiwo. People are decolonizing everything. Even Prince Charles is decolonizing. See, that should stop us in our tracks and make us think, what exactly is going on? Can they just decolonize and return all they've stolen from us? Then I'll be happy with decolonization, but everybody is deploying it. And so it's a double-edged sword. And I think that one subtle or not so subtle thing we have to pay attention to is that every time we're decolonizing every aspect of our lives, what we are doing is colonizing our lives. Meaning that, is it all aspects of our lives that the colonizer has colonized? We need to think about that. Is it possible that one of the ways in which we will go forward is by claiming, as I like to say, claiming our sovereignty, claiming our lives? Let me give you an example. I remember when I first got to graduate school at Berkeley, right? This is the US, where race suffuses everything. So I remember getting into graduate school and I cut off my hair, bald, walking around, and people keep congratulating me on being so progressive. Yeah, the sister is this. But I woke up and said, let me cut it off, right? But by imbuing all aspects of life with race or coloniality, it means that we grant the colonizer, Europe, white people who are the new kids on the block, we put 1 million years of African history, human history, history of humanity. We bring them in and put them at the center of it. So I think that we really need to think about even the whole issue of decolonization. What does it mean? I think the practical aspect is very important, the material aspect, But then in terms of narratives, decolonization cannot be an end in itself. It's a means to an end. And I like to think that that end is claiming or reclaiming our sovereignty. So when we reclaim our sovereignty, what does it mean in terms of everyday life? Then, and one more thing I want to say about decoloniality, and it will show my bias. And some of the people who have encountered me newly since yesterday, they know. In fact, I have just edited a book titled Naming Africans, on the epistemic value of African names. The book came out today. Springer sent me an email. So the theme of our conference is rethinking decoloniality, decolonization and all. And I'm walking around and people are meeting, so many people. They are Peter, Mary, Paul, Joseph, whatever. And we start decolonizing from where we're standing with ourselves. Because names, in the first instance, is that African language question. Don't you think? Name is part of the African language question. The names we bear. And what I'm seeing, in fact, as a watcher of Yoruba land, I'm seeing Yoruba people using English names that people didn't use in the last generation. I'm wondering about it. What is going on? At the same time as we're talking about decolonization, and we must do this and that, that's a very simple aspect of it that is in control, that is in our control, in which we have agency. Yet you see the direction in which people are going is not towards decolonization, it's towards colonization. That we can't even invent names, or we have no names, we have to borrow. So let me not belabor that, but I really want to thank, the discussion is wonderful. I'm feeling very honored. I'm learning more about Oyewumi and the books from what you all are saying. And I'm taking notes because I'm going to be teaching in the fall too. So I'm taking notes about how to go about teaching myself. So I really appreciate all you are saying. And I'm really honored that you've devoted this roundtable to my work. We're not done yet, so let me keep quiet.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you very much. We have time for just one more question.
Okay.
Somebody else in the panel, you want to ask, do you have a question for Professor Oyewumi? No one?
I do have
Okay, yes, please.
I don't have
Okay,
a question, but of course I'm curious about a lot of things, but I think I won't be able to discuss them here. On naming, you mentioned naming, and I'm very, very interested in that. Talking about Oriki, let me just use the Yoruba word. The Oriki, the Christians, especially family Oriki, we discover that there are a lot of names that come up. And when I was doing my master's, I worked on that in films, and I discovered that those names are actually historical. They tell stories. The moment the name is mentioned, it's actually saying something about something that's happened in the history of that family. But yes, there are names that are female names. There are women in history who have done heroic deeds. But I discovered that we have more of male names. Now, my curiosity is it that the women were just not represented? Or is it that they didn't do as much as the men did in history? I don't know if I'm clear.
Yes. Have you read What Gender is Motherhood?
No, I haven't read that.
Okay. The last 3 chapters of What Gender is Motherhood is actually about naming. Is the whole issue of Oriki. investigating Oriki, the personal Oriki, the Abike, Ashake, Alamu, Akanbi, is in the investigation of those names that so much was revealed to me. And so one of the things I want to challenge or correct is your idea that Yoruba names are gendered. Yoruba names they are not gendered. And one of my favorite chapters in invention is the chapter on Samuel Johnson. Okay, so we have 2 minutes. The chapter on Samuel Johnson, the chapter on the invention of history, in which Samuel Johnson, you must know about Samuel Johnson's book, right? The History of the Yorubas. Yes, yes, in which Samuel Johnson gave like 36 names of previous kings in Oyo, and he said, yes, and he said only 1 or 2 had been female. And my chapter was, how does he know that? Right? How does he know that? If Yoruba names are not gendered, if Oba, the category is not gendered. So I think that even that chapter will begin to answer your question. It's also about the recovery of history in the present. If you recover history in a racial society, if you recover Ifa in a male-dominant society, you will find Odu that are male-dominant, right? Is how the present constitutes the past. And I think that that's one way you can begin to think about it. But read the chapter in invention, on history, and Samuel Johnson. And then in What Gender is Motherhood, the last 3 chapters is on naming and the epistemic value of names. And that's why, for me, I think it's important that we bear our names. These are sources of history, all sorts of sources of knowledge. And let me end what I'm saying, because it's time, with one quote, and this quote is in the book too. The great South African anthropologist who was very much oppressed by the apartheid regime. In fact, when he got a job in Cape Town, I believe in the 60s, the apartheid government said Cape Town had to remove him. He had this wonderful statement, and the statement is, what are the sources of African knowledge? And how do we get at it? Names are sources of African knowledge. If we don't bear the names, how will we get at that knowledge? Even greetings are sources. And I thought that his question was radical, because he took the idea of African knowledge for granted, that Africa has knowledge to impart to the world. Because one of the saddest things that we find these days is that we don't think we have knowledge. We don't think there's anything to impart. That's why we're going here and there and all whatnot. So let me end there. Let us look inward. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been an honor to have you here as our respondent and as our special guest. And I want to thank our panelists as well for your profound thought, for your immense contributions. I hope we can carry on this conversation next year. I'm planning to run this next year as a proper paper presentation panels. Next year ASA, I think ASA will be a good starting point, and then also ASA Africa as well. So thank you very much for those of you who are also in the room as well, for taking your time to come and be part of this session. Thank you, Rosa Oyewumi. It's always an honor to have a conversation with you. Thank you so much.
Crystal, Mara, and people I'm just meeting. I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, bro.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Shola, for organizing.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.